to start our session this morning.
Was this go something?
We're going to be focusing on ASEAN. Emerging Tigers is the name of this particular session. I'll quickly introduce the panelists. At the end, we have Jennifer Lee, who's a advisor for Learn Capital. Jennifer is a seasoned investor who has led or contributed to several investments around the world, including Southeast Asia. Jennifer's also a Harvard Business School graduate. Next to Jennifer, we have Mr. Tuan Pham from Topica. He's the CEO and founder of Topica, arguably one of the most successful EdTech companies in Southeast Asia, based in Vietnam, but they have a presence in several countries throughout the region. Next to Tuan, we have Ms. Tu Nguyen from also Vietnam. Ms. Tu is the co-founder of Yola, which is an education service provider company in Vietnam that does things like test prep and English language learning and whatnot. It's one of the more successful education companies in Vietnam as well. And next to Tu, we have Mr. Shafiq Khan, representing the nonprofit segment. So basically we have three commercial interests and then a nonprofit segment here. And Mr. Khan has been around as a digital transformation expert for quite a while. He worked in the travel or hospitality industry since the 90s and was leading the digital transformation efforts of large companies like Marriott and United Airlines. So he has a very unique view of digital transformation in other sectors. Then myself, I'm Mike Michalec, the managing director and founder of EdTech Asia. We're a community network and platform that does a lot of capacity building for education innovators in Asia. So again, welcome this morning. And Shafiq, since you're closest to me, I think we'll start off with you. Again, as I just mentioned, you've been at this for a while and you've seen digital transformation in other sectors. What are you seeing in the education sector? Because you're fairly new to education, for just a couple of years now. What are some of the similarities or things that you're observing in education?
So the first thing I'll say is I know probably far less than anybody in this room about education. Which is both a liability and an asset. So let me tell you about my perspectives. EdTech today reminds me of 1995 in travel and in online as it was just coming up. It has incredible promise, and we are looking at a $5 trillion education market. $3.5 trillion is just spent by governments, and then if you take in all the private parties involved, you're talking about a $5 trillion plus market. So it clearly seems to be at a very exciting stage. In 1995, online was poised to take off. It hadn't taken off yet. The internet was just there. In fact, we were in pre-internet times. So this reminds me of 1995 in many ways, except that I just feel that EdTech is stuck. EdTech is not growing as online was growing in 1995, which was 200, 300% a year. The numbers I've seen are 17% growth, which for any business is good, but when you're talking about a $5 trillion market, that eventually should all be tech, and you should not be thinking about EdTech, it's just ed. 17% growth is not very impressive. So I feel that right now, you need a catalyzing force to break through. And the catalyzing force, my view, perhaps a biased view, is going to be the developing world. Now you'd ask, why the developing world versus the developed world? The developing world has the most pain. The developing world does not have any current infrastructure. I look at a country like Pakistan, where we're operating. We have massive illiteracy, 20.5 million kids out of school. We also have, in the 45 million that are going to school, frankly, 50+% are barely getting an education. So there's a massive need, huge investment being made there by the government, investments being made by what I call the global educational funding establishment, the World Banks, the DFIDs, the USAID to some degree, not enough. So in the developing world, the need is great. And I think if the developing world was looked at as the catalyst, in fact, for you guys, think about investing in the developing world, making it happen in the developing world. And if you do that, the likelihood that you will have created a proposition that can then be accepted all over the world, and EdTech really will pop. Now, I'll give you an analog to that. The best way to think about that is to look at mobile. So think about mobile about 15 years ago. Mobile was actually struggling in the US, growing in a very small fashion. Mobile actually took off from the developing world. And it took off because in the developing world, they had, I mean, it used to take 4 years in Karachi to get a landline. Now it takes 5 minutes to get a phone. They had no infrastructure, and their strategy became a leapfrog strategy. And all of a sudden, they moved from nothing to the most advanced technology in the world. In fact, they were way ahead of the United States 5 years ago. Maybe today even, they might be. And so my assessment of this is that mobile was made by players like Nokia, players like LG, players like Ericsson investing significantly in the developing world. And once that happened, they had so much scale that the market then completely took off. And frankly, Apple in 2007 came in after the market had already happened and, again, took it to another level.
In the U.S. Jennifer, this is interesting. You've obviously looked at a lot of different geographies around the world and have you've led an investment in Southeast Asia. In terms of leapfrogging, as you mentioned, what is your perception on countries within Southeast Asia that have the potential to leapfrog and kind of skip a few steps?
Yeah, I think that's a great point by Shafiq. I mean, from a macroeconomic perspective, I think Southeast Asia poses a really interesting opportunity, right? I mean, we can take a country like the Philippines, for example. You have 100 million population, so young, big population. Economic growth, GDP is about 7% for the last 3 years, so booming. Huge willingness to spend on education from a net income perspective. And in terms of leapfrog technology, it's something like 99% of individuals who have access to the internet have like Facebook or other social media accounts, like very engaged. We saw that happen in banking for Philippines. I remember like their mobile banking was one of the first, in addition, like through mobile payments was incredibly progressive back in the mid-2000 periods. And I think we see that same opportunity for education providers in the region as well.
Do you think, can you see a dominant, as of now, aside from maybe Topica, actually just Topica right now, but there's no considerable dominant player within the region or pan-region. So do you see that potentially happening in Southeast Asia soon?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm sure Tuan has an opinion on who that will be.
We'll ask him in a minute.
But I think that is something that we think about as outside investor, like particularly as we think about are there big enough opportunities within the region? Because on the one hand, there are very large markets, Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam, where you could, if you owned all of education, $20 billion industry in education in the Philippines, could that be a big enough investor sitting, could that be a big enough outcome for investors sitting in Silicon Valley? I think the answer is yes. Could it be even bigger if they were a regional player? I think that there's a lot of heterogeneity within the markets, which makes it quite difficult, right? There's a lot of national pride, there's a lot of preference, I think, in certain markets for local players. So not only do we have to think about, can someone be a pan-region player, what about, like, can the big players that have become global players elsewhere, can they go into the region and own it, right? Can we see Coursera from a MOOC perspective coming in and owning Southeast Asia? Can we see Udemy as an online provider come in, even from like a test prep situation? And I think that we see difficulty in global players entering the market because of those idiosyncrasies, the difference in the population, the cultural difference, but that also somewhat argues for it being quite difficult for a local player to become regional.
Right.
I think they kind of struggle in the same way, but I imagine Tuan might have clearly a different opinion because Topica is doing quite well.
Yeah. Tuan, so this is a good segue into you. So to give you a little bit of background on Topica, it's based in Vietnam, but they have a considerable presence in Philippines and Thailand, other countries as well. Singapore, they have an office. So Tuan, what's your experience? Give us some insight on taking your company throughout the region as opposed to just focusing on one country.
Yes, it's definitely a very, so each market is definitely very different in terms of culture and language and obviously many factors. What we have been trying to do so far is to make sure that each of the market is run by local managers and talent. So we place a lot of emphasis in hiring local talent in Bangkok, in Jakarta, for which offices we set up. For the first 18 months, we may have to send in people from headquarters, but after that, we make sure that we groom the next generation of talent and hand it over to them to make sure that all these local nuances are well managed by them.
Could you help us understand some of the different products or services that Topica has? I mean, you have an English language platform and a few others.
Yes, so basically we do three different things, 3 or 4 different things. The first one is an online English tutoring service, so live speech tutoring service. The second one is an online short courses platform. And the third one is an online degree enabling product with universities. So fully online degree programs for universities. And we also run an accelerator program, which is more like investment in talent and branding. And these all together actually have a lot of synergies across these different products. And we're replicating these models across the 3-4 market that we are in.
Of those that you just described, are any of them more dominant than the other or in particular
Roughly
markets?
equal in size. Okay. And each of them have very different goals and profitability profile. And they complement each other in terms of users and students, branding, and traffic.
Can I ask Tuan a question?
Yeah.
When you go into a new market and you have a local team managing the same product across the different regions, do you find that the local population sees it as, like, does they see Topica then in Indonesia as an Indonesian brand, or do they see it as a Vietnamese brand, or do they see it as a Southeast Asian brand?
They see it as a international brand with presence in somewhere. So we used to worry about how whether we be seen as a Vietnamese brand, which may or may not be appealing to let's say a Thai population, right? But what we found is actually being a regional company give it a certain brand respected image. So we don't have the problem of being seen as a lower country brand anymore.
Okay. Two, so your company, also based in Vietnam, has a large emphasis on English language instruction. Obviously, it's a huge market within Southeast Asia as well. Give us a little bit of background on what you have gone through in establishing your company. Fairly new, 7 or 8 years now? believe. Right?
8 years.
Did you adopt any, did you look at any business models or adopt anything from other countries in terms of setting up your business in Vietnam?
Yeah, so I grew up in Vietnam. I was born in Vietnam. I consider myself a product of mixed education systems. So I went to public school in Vietnam, then went to the US for college, and then later on did some short courses in Singapore, China, France, etc. And so I've been spending a lot of time thinking about when we do education business, how are we developing people growing up in different country settings? Does that mean we have one model and we can scale in different countries? Or does that mean in each country, the scale of that has to be deeper? So in my context, when my co-founders and I, we looked into that opportunity of English language in Vietnam, we actually had a lens of how are we building the next generation of Vietnam in 20 years? What do they need? Yes, they need language, but they also need to own really the new Vietnam future. And what does that mean, right? Does that mean we have to build critical thinking skills? Does that mean we have to also bring our middle income students to think about the next social challenges in Vietnam? So with that lens, the kind of experiments that we've been able to do with Yola were things like we have a blended model for English learning. We also do a lot of empowerment, meaning we do blended camps so that students can learn about social issues. They come together, they use English to present their innovative ideas. So I don't know if that's answering your question of like,
Little bit.
Getting inspiration from any model, or more like this is the context that we see in our country, in our generation, and there's something we can do about it.
Yeah, I think what I was just trying to allude to is, and maybe Jennifer, you can comment on this as well, are there any particular business models that are unique or that appear to be doing well in the region? Are there any sub-segments of the market that, there's significant market opportunity for a unique business model to come in? And Jennifer, you've researched a lot in the region. Do you have any insight on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I mentioned this a little bit earlier, the high spend of net income on education is pretty unique to the region. Tuan, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe in Vietnam, it's like 40% of net income or higher is spent, like, that's post-tax spending.
Irregardless of how much people are earning.
Irregardless of how much people are earning or
more,
spend on
spend
educational
more.
service. So there's opportunity really to go from a B2C standpoint that is quite attractive and can lead to very quick growth, right? Like you don't have the long sales cycles of trying to sell to an institution, to a government ministry of education, and I think that makes it rather attractive. And what we're seeing is that that's true at every single age, right? Like that's true for very young kids, and I can think of like Pham in Korea that's also doing quite, not Southeast Asia, but they're doing, I think they get some presence in Thailand. And then, at a super young age, but also in adult continuing education, thinking about it from an ROI perspective for income and opportunity. So I think to me that's been kind of the most exciting models within the region. This probably is actually a greater reflection of my lack of knowledge than anything, but I haven't yet, or I'm not quite aware of some of the models that look towards servicing the schools themselves at any great scale. I've maybe seen one or two. But.
In my understanding, your company has a unique arrangement with some of the public schools in Vietnam, which is not common. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, 90% of our students come from the public school segment. So one of the most effective strategies for customer acquisition for us is to partner with the schools. Now, the partnership might vary depending on the school settings and what the school needs. Sometimes we help them organize whole student competition. Sometimes we actually invite their teachers to come to Yola and share experiences and do more professional development with them. So through a lot of that, then yes, it serves our business, but also our hope is that that also get the school to think about what are the alternative curriculum and ways of learning thinking that they can bring to the students as well.
Tuan, as you've expanded your business throughout the region, could you share a little bit of insight on some of the barriers to market entry that you've experienced? I mean, you did allude to that you go in and you hire local initially for the first 18 months, but is there any other, I'm guessing that some of the attendees here have companies that are looking to enter ASEAN markets. Can you give them some tips or some experience you've had?
Sure. A couple interesting things we went through. For example, I think the biggest challenge we face for each new market is local sales force. Mm-hmm. So in order to sell in a new market, you need people who speak the local language. But typically these people, they don't speak English. So the only way to train them is through their own language. So we would have managers who speak Vietnamese or English, but we would have Thai sales staff who only speak Thai and no English. Yeah. So how do you make sure they talk to each other? So the only solution is to find bilingual people. So luckily we managed to find, so our team actually had to go down to remote provinces in Vietnam where happened to be an ethnicity that spoke Thai. Mm-hmm. And it took 6 to 9 months to find enough people to bring them in, train them on sales in Vietnamese, and then they can go and train the other sales staff in Thai language. And so that's what took the most of time. And the same thing happened for Indonesia, and I can imagine the same thing happened in every country you go into. And that cannot be skipped by online, by doing things online. And the second challenge we had is usually each of these countries have a different New Year. So Vietnam, we celebrate Lunar New Year.
Yes.
In Thailand, there is Songkran, which is currently going on.
Right now, yeah.
In Indonesia, there is Ramadan, which is every year is a different month. So it's even harder to predict what happens. And during this New Year, it's not a few days, it's usually a few weeks where there's no sales and marketing. People just off on holidays. And being able to predict these different New Year dates, which falls on different dates for each country for each year, and then predict our revenues and our expenses and our staffing accordingly is a major challenge across the region.
Shafiq, this is, again, you're coming from the nonprofit lens, but maybe you can share some insight on your sustainability model, and is my understanding, you're not actively engaged in Southeast Asia at the moment, but you're looking to go beyond South Asia. So tell us go ahead.
So for us, we're called Teach the World. So we have immodest ambitions. We are modest people, though. In our view, what we are looking to do is to essentially address illiteracy. Clearly, education in EdTech has applications everywhere. I mean, there's so many different parts of education that can be affected by tech. We've essentially focused on illiteracy, largely because it's one of the biggest issues. In a country like Pakistan, I'll just use that as an example. We have 20.5 million out-of-school children. We have a very large number of people going to school that aren't being educated appropriately. And so our entire focus is on creating mechanisms that go over the constraints, that remove the constraint of a teacher, for instance, or the absence of a teacher, and teach using a concept that is online, e-learning, delivered on a user-friendly device such as a tablet, and delivered in a gamified format. And our sweet spot is K through 5. K through 5 is very ripe for gamification. We think we are going to have huge success with it. We've already had one phase, the proof of concept phase, where frankly I was expecting X, I got 4X, then I got Y and Z, I mean, so much more. At this point, we're in the next phase, which is scaling, proving that our model can scale. Again, by the grace of God, with great success. We're scaled from a few dozen to now a few hundred, leading to a few thousand very quickly.
So are you looking to go beyond, obviously Pakistan? What are
Yes.
some of the things that you're taking into account now to help you make that adjustment later?
So at this point, we are looking at where the highest needs are, and in many cases, we are responding to the highest need, partly because we are a social impact organization. So oddly enough, while the initial focus, our initial interest was going to sub-Saharan Africa, the fact is we did our proof of concept in Pakistan. So many people approached us and got interested that we ended up being approached by some of the best NGOs in the country. And so we started in Pakistan.
Is this how you're
Then-
sustainable now in terms
Yes.
of?
So right now, the sustainability is a function of the partner funding operation on the ground, we providing the intellectual capital and the resources, the curation of the content, the research, etc. And you talked about what segments. So actually, we're in Bangladesh too, largely in refugee camps. We're just starting work in the Rohingya refugee camps in the next month. We should launch there. And so we are, to some degree, you could argue that we are, because of the social impact nature of our business, we are reacting first to where the greatest need is. And if you just look at the Rohingya refugee situation, 300,000 children in camps who do not have an education. Sustainability-wise, let me tell you what I'm thinking about, and I may be off on that. But right now, we're not going to the global educational funding establishment for money. We are funding largely through our own resources and private foundations, and so far, good. Okay. The next phase is where we actually already have the World Bank working with us. In fact, we are having the World Bank set up a consortium of players from the global educational funding establishment, including themselves, USAID, big foundations, to look at our new model. And if our new model is more effective, then we expect these guys are already spending billions of dollars. Correct, yeah. We expect them to be now funding new models. And obviously, illiteracy for everyone is a big thing.
So this is an interesting point. This is why you're here as well. It seems in Southeast Asia, there, in terms of EdTech companies, there are a lot that are addressing the significant English language market and tutoring market and test prep and all of this. But there seems to be a potential observed lack of solution providers addressing core issues in education. So I'll ask Tu and Tuan, let's take Vietnam, for example. Are there any significant core issues that aren't being addressed by a solution provider now? Are there opportunities throughout the region that you see, market gaps that are open?
I would say pretty much everything. So in the US, for example, you guys have a great K-12 education system, a great college, university system. Of course, people are not satisfied, so there is a lot of startup trying to improve on them, right? But in South Asia, there is nothing, right? So there's no K-12 education system that is to any extent acceptable to the parents. So parents keep being frustrated every day with the lack of proper education opportunity for their children, except for the international school, except for the relatively expensive private schools. Right? But the vast majority of the students, they struggle to find any opportunity for acceptable for their children. For the college level, the same thing. So everyone trying to go abroad to study if they can. And there's a huge opportunity for local international colleges, local quality online programs. Yeah, so you're not competing with a legacy system and trying to improve it. You have basically a green field of market and demands to solve. But of course, you have to go against the regulators who don't want you to do that. right? But there are ways to stay away of them keeping you from doing things. So the huge opportunity almost everywhere. It's a huge untapped market, and the way you look at how China, education in China just exploded, online education and international school exploded like in the last couple of years. I think the same thing will happen in our region in the next couple of years as well. Yeah, so the huge opportunity everywhere. There is the right timing for new players to come in because internet adoption is there, awareness of ability to pay is there. So now is the best time to start doing things.
May I ask Tuan a question?
Sure.
So Tuan, are you getting interest from funders at the level that you want?
Yes, we start getting a lot of interest from investors in the last 2 years or so. So it was a very quiet industry before.
Yeah.
And we used to struggle a lot to find funding, but the last 2 years have been amazing in terms of interest. And it's not only us, so all the different local players. You keep hearing about new companies, EdTech companies, offline education companies getting funded.
Great.
A lot more interest.
You mentioned China, and it's just interesting as a lot of large Chinese companies have increasingly been showing interest in entering Southeast Asia when traditionally they haven't the last few years. So for example, VIP Kid, obviously is highlighted here, is looking to enter potentially different markets and whatnot. What kind of advice, again, for potential companies that are in the audience, would you have for Vietnam specifically? And we can talk, since both of you are Vietnam, I think we should highlight Vietnam a little bit because it is quite unique for a lot of reasons. Just for the audience, whether or not you're a fan of the PISA rankings, but Vietnam is an outlier. So I think it scored 11th or 12th globally, so it was the only developing or emerging country that scored quite high. There's a lot of government policy that's being changed right now. I think Decree 7073, which is making it a lot easier for international institutions to establish schools or universities within Vietnam, which has traditionally been tightly controlled by the government. So there's a lot of interesting changes and uniqueness of the Vietnamese market that are appealing to not only Chinese companies, but other companies around the world. And when they look at when they assess to see which country within ASEAN they would like to enter first, obviously Philippines, you have less of a language barrier. Indonesia has a significantly larger population. But Vietnam seems to be getting a lot of attention recently. So what are some of the other, speaking as a Vietnamese, what are some of the other cultural uniqueness that make Vietnam this kind of hotbed? And two, I mean, you're a perfect example of kind of a reverse brain drain that's going on. There's a lot of foreign educated Vietnamese that are returning and setting up education companies quite successfully as well, and you're a perfect example of that. So maybe some insight on what else do you think Vietnam has in terms of the region and it differentiates it?
Yeah, I think it's probably not only unique to Vietnam and more like the startup mindset and how to operate in an emerging economy. So start fast and fail fast. We started with $10,000 US, now reaching $10 million revenues. That's the sort of context and opportunities that you can have in those markets. However, because it's an emerging economy, not everything will be ready. It's not like we can feel safe tomorrow and know exactly what's going on. And just, I guess we just embraced it and live with it. Yeah.
Tuan, do you have any comments on the uniqueness of Vietnam? What makes it kind of special within the region?
It's just one relatively obvious thing, but it's a quite important language, right? So Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia are similar in the way that very few people speak fluent English to the extent that they can understand a training course in English. So So when we bring in a lot of, we have partnership with people like Coursera or Udacity. When we bring in programs, we have to make sure that they translate it or subtitles, or there are projects, let's say an online digital marketing course, that we need to create an local project with local mentors to make sure that we can reach the majority of the students. And so Philippines is an exception. So in the region, Philippines, Malaysia would be countries where people speak very well English. But most of the other countries, you need to heavily localize and translate.
Actually, I have a follow-up point on that. Because of the differences in language, one could actually have this hypothesis that there's a lot of opportunity for English training, not as a tool to migrate into a Western country, but actually to do business internationally.
And Jennifer, you've got a unique perspective being US-based and then looking at different markets to invest in. Tell us a little bit about kind of the process, or how have you determined which countries within ASEAN seem to be the most appealing, or any apprehension you may have for a particular market to invest? Or...
Yeah, I think one of the things that Tuan touched on actually is very true. There's a lot of greenfield opportunity, right? We see a lot of opportunity in markets that where you would expect a solution and player to exist. We haven't yet seen one, right? So I advise for a company called Edukasyon in the Philippines, and they're a platform, basically a way for students to learn about all the various different college opportunities and to kind of do an enhanced application that allows them to apply directly to a whole subset of them. Really interesting company. There's 1,000 universities in the Philippines. That's a lot. And they're all very local, and they don't have great regional brands, and there's no information to share about which one makes sense, which one's going to give you the best ROI or return on your education. And so I think there's really big, interesting opportunities and models that just in my head make sense, and we've seen them make sense elsewhere. Mm-hmm. So from that perspective, I think that there's clear opportunities as an investor. I think that we're seeing also more and more local investors start taking the initial risk in the early stages, which is honestly, as a foreigner, great. And I think that's helpful too, because they also have a much better insight into what are the idiosyncrasies that that particular company faces. And then when they get to a certain scale, I mean, this sounds like such a cop-out on our side, but as they start to scale and we can see them kind of take off, then we can help them think about how do they think about the entire region, what are best practices that have happened in other countries that can then be applied in their own local market, right? So I think from that perspective, we're quite excited about things. I mean, I've seen also a really great opportunity in Singapore that was kind of at the forefront of competency-based hiring, which is an area that we're super excited about. Let's get on the hiring beyond what degree did you have, what school did you go to, what was your high-stakes exam score at 16, and let's look at your skills and aptitude and whether or not that applies to the job. And we saw one in the financial field in Singapore that's well, this makes sense here, but this makes sense globally everywhere as well. Mm-hmm. And I think they were just ahead of the curve from some of the other models that we've even seen in the US.
Would you say are there any common misconceptions that people have about investing in the region? And feel free to also comment, because Tuan, you're obviously dealing with a lot of investors the last few years. I mean, what kind of misconceptions are you experiencing?
I think that's actually a better question for you, since I'm sure there's misconceptions I have, but I'm probably not self-aware enough yet to understand what all of them are.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure what the exact misconceptions are, if there are any, but so investors seem to be quite clearly divided among people who made up their mind that they want to invest in the region and people who don't. Mm-hmm. And usually it takes a couple of years for investors to really understand the region and start making deals. And after that, after the first year, usually they overcome the concerns and the misconception they have, and they keep investing. But then people who have never started doing deals there, it's very hard to convince them to come into the region. Unless there is a lead investor and someone can follow with a certain deal. And so I think it has to do with, I'm not sure whether it has to do with misconception or just the fact that it's really hard to manage a portfolio from distance. So either you have a local team or you don't.
I think the other thing that, as a foreigner, recognize that you are acutely aware of what you don't know, which is a lot, right? So what does Learn Capital know? Learn Capital really understands education models, education technology, how people think about the acquisition of skill sets and new modals and mediums, and how people also evaluate and convey those skill sets and aptitudes in the market. What we don't know all that well is Indonesia, right? So in that sense, if we were to go in an Indonesian company, we would love to have a local partner who really understands like the ins and outs of those businesses. And I think each time that we have actually invested in the region, when we've gone it alone, it's been more painful, right? And when we've had good trusted partners in the region, it's been a different case.
I guess it depends on what types of investors or funds you're talking about. I mean, if you're a $1 billion fund looking into one country market, the math might not make sense. But if it's a few million dollars fund, then yes, there's opportunity to still bet on who's the next unicorn for each country. And there are case studies, good examples of people who have been able to do that. The difference, again, I guess, the risk that those fund managers will take is, am I going to go and set up an office there, have local investment teams and operational advisors to help the local companies. So that's the sort of efforts that not many people who, I guess, not familiar with the market would think about it, at least at the beginning. And as Tuan said, after a few years of study, that's how they would, I guess, enter the market.
I think traditionally, just over the last few years, a lot of the markets are quite small, so they've just kind of been overlooked a lot by the investment community. If you look at population of Thailand or Vietnam, 70, 90 million people, and investors will focus on China and whatnot. But like I said, I think increasingly we're seeing a lot more interest in the region collectively. So Shafiq, to go back to the nonprofit hat, what kind of solutions have you been seeing? Maybe you can talk a little bit about your own as well, that seem to be working in terms of affecting learning, impacting learning outcomes in a positive way, that could be applied to ASEAN in your experience?
So I think you've got to think about it at the 100,000-foot level. So when you have a situation where you don't have teachers, in fact, teach isn't what you can do. In fact, I've probably named my organization wrong. It's teach. But you can't teach. So what are you going to do? So now you've got to think from a very different lens. And you've got to think of the learn lens. So you've got to focus on learn. Well, how are you going to make learning happen? Having seen what's happened in the digital world and online, clearly self-learning is the way to go. And so we've actually developed self-learning models. So the combination of online on tablets in a game format is largely about learning, self-learning. Fantastic results. In our case, we were expecting to do, on a scale of 1 to 10, 5 versus the traditional system, which had teachers and instruction and a regular school. We ended up doing 21 and 25, respectively, in reading and math. So it was very clear that self-learning, because of the very high engagement that you get from self-learning, was very successful. And frankly, it was so successful that we are now scaling even within existing systems of schools that, for instance, teaching English. We're using our apps to teach English where they were teaching English through the regular run-of-the-mill teacher. In Pakistan, for instance, English is a second language, and while it's people are pretty conversant with it, the fact is it isn't taught well in the poorer, in the less developed parts of the country. In fact, often you find the only teacher missing is the English teacher. So in our case, we've had one of the largest NGOs in Pakistan just essentially take our model for only teaching English. And there are others who are just essentially taking it for literacy and creating literacy wherever there is a need. So one of the projects we have is in the Himalayas up in the north, 10,000 feet and above. There's nobody who's educated wants to live there. So then you don't find teachers. And as a result, again, we have this self-learning model, which, again, as I said before, I was not expecting it to do anywhere near as well as it did. And it's actually ending up being the solution.
But so do you see potentially taking this to other countries? Obviously, Laos and Cambodia and some countries within ASEAN have significant literacy issues. So, like, how do you potentially see taking your idea there?
I see, in fact, I think this is part of why I'm here, is also to connect with people like Tu and Tuan. I think this is a model that is portable all over the world. And again, take macro at the 100,000 foot level. Shifting the focus from teach, which is a push approach, and sure, that was the only approach we could have, to a pull, which is learn, is something that's applicable everywhere, at every level, from kindergarten to PhD. Right. So I think it's portable, and I think one of the things we want to do is take our experiences, actually nail them in Pakistan and Bangladesh. At this point, we're actually looking, with the help of the World Bank, at a location in Anglophone Sub-Saharan Africa as well. That'll probably happen by the end of this year. And once we have 2 or 3 different models, we will be pushing for this model everywhere.
Great. Well, curious to see what happens the next year. We have about 5 minutes left, so I think if we can just leave with one maybe key point or tip for maybe some of the investors or companies in the audience that are looking to engage ASEAN. For those of you that walked in late, because the room's a lot fuller now than it was at the beginning, this session's essentially focused on ASEAN, which constitutes 10 countries in Southeast Asia, 650 million people. So we've been focusing on that. But Jennifer, if you want to just leave with like one key nugget of advice and your experience engaging in the region, please do.
Oh, geez. I guess as an outsider, this seems like such an obvious point, but sometimes it's worth stating the obvious. It's really worth spending time on the ground, right? And it doesn't mean, oh, okay, so now I've been to the Philippines and I feel comfortable investing in Vietnam. It's like, no, you actually have to go visit every single one of those countries, and you should spend time in the market, visiting the local players, learning from their expertise, right? I think because there's a lot of excitement and opportunity, and to a large extent, you just have to be made aware of it, right? The promotion outside to find capital exterior is maybe not as strong as the opportunities are exciting.
Right. So just on the ground presence, deep understanding of the culture and the Education. Okay. Tuan?
It's a 500 million population market, so half the size of China. So it's a very attractive opportunity and a lot of opportunity in very different segments and niches. It's hard to understand each market. We spend a lot of time solving that problem. So one of the options anyone want to go to a region you may want to think of is to partner with people like ourselves. For example, for people like Udacity or Coursera, they thought it's easier to just join a distribution partnership and having someone locally like us helping them distribute the products. So we're here to help. We're happy to love to talk to you guys if anyone want to enter the region. And we have about 500,000 paying users across 3-4 different countries. So happy to excited to get into partnerships.
Just a very fun point, trying out food. We have more than pho. Thailand has more than tom yum. You probably get to know a lot more about how local people think about history, business, and life with food.
And how about scaling impact?
So from our perspective, my advice, and I don't know if the players here are the size that can have global impact, but if you guys are thinking of global impact, then I would suggest take a very hard look at the analogs that have existed, that have made the market pop. And mobile was one, as I mentioned before. Actually, mobile payments right now is huge. Africa is way ahead of everybody in the world in terms of innovating on mobile payments. So look at the analogs and basically see if you can replicate them for EdTech. And my advice or suggestion and invitation would be, if you want to work in a major South Asian country, Pakistan or Bangladesh, and we'll soon be in India as well, which have some of the largest populations in the world, you may have a very significant opportunity essentially addressing the pain points, the biggest pain points that these countries have, their governments have. And once you do that, I think you're going to get scale in such a fashion that that scale will move you anywhere, will allow you to move anywhere.
Okay. So that will conclude our panel. For those that are interested in ASEAN, you can have a look at their websites or EdTech Asia. So thank you very much, and thank you, panelists.